getting back to our comic book theme for a moment here, we'll be covering a lot of that, I think, next month when we look at the Rambo 3.5 comic. But that might actually leak out into Season 4. I think we're going to start Season 4 early in July, so I think that will probably go in there with all the different versions of Rambo 4 that were pitched before the Rambo 4 we got. So, this, the Rambo 3 comic, I've seen pages from the comic. I haven't read the whole thing, but I've seen pages. And also, a lot of it ties into the storyboards. Mike Chapman sent me some of those storyboards. If you go back to one of our earlier interviews with Mike Chapman, those storyboards are in there, and I think pages of the comic book are in there, but I'm not entirely sure. But the 1988 Rambo Children's Annual, and I just want to say, when we get to comics, we'll also be covering Mad Magazine and all that, but all the parodies too. The Children's Annual is keeping in continuation from the Force of Freedom series. I think that was disbanded by that point. I can't remember for sure. I know I got the dates on all of the dates. We looked at every single episode of Force of Freedom back at the end of Season 2. So if you go back a bit to Season 2 near the end, the Force of Freedom, you'll see everything in there. But this piece came out after the Rambo 3 comic book, not to be mixed up with Rambo 3.5. I would say more as a parody. So Den of Geek, yeah, like I was saying, Den of Geek has this awesome little report on this. So I'm going to read you what Den of Geek had to say about the 1988 Rambo Children's Annual. So it says, a kid's book based around a violent post-traumatic stress disorder sufferer, played by Sylvester Stallone, we analyzed the Rambo Annual. John Rambo was first introduced to cinema audiences in 1982's First Blood, based on David Morrell's novel of the same name. Sylvester Stallone starred as Rambo, a mentally scarred war veteran, clearly suffering from undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. His fractured mental state, along with a spate of bad luck, leads him to ultimately commit acts of unacceptable violence. We touched on this already in the past, but this is just kind of like a do-over again, and I'm sure we're going to do this over again in the future, but for now, just because, we're trying to cover all the angles of Rambo 3, let's throw this in there until we get to the stuff after 9/11. So, it is a film with no real heroes, a deep mystery of authority, and a supporting character who dies of cancer because of extended exposure to Agent Orange. It is not what you would call a barrel of laughs, so of course they made a kid's cartoon out of it. This isn't that unique. R-rated movies are being adapted into Saturday morning cartoons. It is one of the more curious phenomena of the 80s and early 90s. It happened with RoboCop, Highlander, and most bizarrely, Trauma's Toxic Avenger. The Rambo show, Rambo Force of Freedom, to give it its full title, ran for one full season in 1986. What a season that was. Spinning out of the popularity of the second Rambo film. It wasn't particularly successful, but it was enough to spin off some merchandise, including a toy line, and in the UK, an annual for Christmas in 1987. That's right, for Christmas 1987, you can get an annual based around a violent post-traumatic stress disorder sufferer who put under the Christmas tree for your son or daughter. Look, not to be confused with annuals in the U.S., so I'm pretty sure this was reissued in 1988. In a U.S. comic book, not to be confused with the annuals in U.S. comic books, UK annuals are likely a memorial part of many of our childhoods. They're large-size hardcover books printed in the run-up to Christmas. which are designed as easily stocking fillers for desperate parents or lazy, distant relatives. Probably the most iconic annuals are those of the Beano and the Dandy, bumper collections of extended adventures for Dennis the Menace and Desperate Dan. But these days, they are produced for virtually anything and will appeal to modern kids. Recent years saw one of the Avengers, Doctor Who, and WWE, Hunger Games, football teams, and One Direction, generally licensed property that appeals to children ages 5 to 12, taking up shelves space at W.H. Smith's. In 2014, multimedia conglomerates are very protective of their characters, but a quarter of a century ago, you sense that they didn't have quite the same stronghold. And the further down the food chain you go, the more they seem to be able to get away with. By the time it comes to merchandising that's licensed out to other territories, it's hard to know who's looking after it. When comic books and annuals of U.S. properties are created for the UK market, it's just reproposed content from American sources. They are several decades worth of Marvel superhero annuals that just reprinted random issues of Captain America and the Hulk, but sometimes they'd be forced to create their own content. Occasionally, this leads to semi-interesting alternate continualities. For example, in the case of the UK comics for both Sonic the Hedgehog and Transformers, both of them still have a cult following online, but usually it just led to weird off-model stories that even as a kid you knew were wrong. The 1988 Rambo annual definitely falls into that latter category. Googling the cartoon series and toy line, it doesn't even seem like any of the generic artwork used to promote them has been used in the annual. Usually the territories would receive a load of approved ready-made artwork to use, but it seems like in the Rambo annual, everything has been originally created. Somewhere in the mid-80s, bored, desperate British writers and artists were churning this out, probably clueless as to what the whole thing was about. It's a wonderful, unique item, and a gaze into a bizarre parallel version of an iconic character. I'm obsessed with it. I found it in a charity shop, and it's in mint condition. It hasn't been chewed or drawn on or anything. The juxtaposition of one of the most violent characters in cinematic history and children's coloring activities is endlessly fascinating. So are the attempts to bend the adult characters and situations into something suitable for 8-year-olds. The first few pages of the book are a primer on the cartoon based on the film, based on the novel that the annual is based on. For the animated series, John Rambo has been recast as a member of a shonky G.I. Joe knockoff team of generic action heroes. Colonel Troutman is the only character to make the crossover from the big screen. He is basically a takes on Professor X or Splinter role, telling them to go on missions while he stays at home out of danger. The profile of Rambo 2 in the book makes no mention of the events or of either First Blood or Rambo First Blood Part 2. Only that he joined the Force of Freedom after a successful military career with the U.S. Army. While we might not get the exact details of John Rambo's military career in First Blood, I think we can ascertain that successful would not be an accurate word to describe it. Also in the team are Cat and Turbo, a master of disguise and weapons expert, both taking up 2 rules that were on every generic 80s and 90s action film. And because it's a kid's cartoon, they are a woman and a black guy respectively, to give the illusion of diversity, though, of course, the series still focuses on a white male. Actually, it doesn't. You're wrong here, because Rambo is half German, and he's half Indian, and my kind of Indian. So, it focuses on a red man. Anyway, rounding out the team is potentially the most exciting character, White Dragon, who's a white ninja. And of that, he's a Westerner who dresses in a white ninja costume. It's a recurring concept of the 80s VHS era ninja films, from Franco Nero and Enter the Ninja to Michael Dudikoff in the American Ninja films. Strangely and disappointingly, he doesn't actually appear in any of the comic strips in the annual.